It's all relative here, but no, I'm really, really glad to be here to talk with you about a topic that is really near and dear to my heart, but has only been so for about the past 13 years or so. Because even though I've been in the area of chemistry and learning support, and you saw that I tutored, I've been tutoring since 1970. I started when I was 4 years old, if you're getting my age from that. But I didn't know the things that we're going to be talking about this afternoon until I got to LSU about 13 years ago. And I was really amazed at the impact that knowing about metacognition and teaching students metacognitive strategies could have on not just student performance, but on student motivation and on their willingness to work. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And let me just say, it's really great to be back in Michigan. I have a lot of connections to Michigan, starting with my uncle, who got his master's degree from Michigan State University back in around 1955. Anybody here from Michigan State? Oh, okay, great. And my sister got her master's from Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. And I know there are folks here from there. And my husband, when he was a kid, used to pick blueberries in Muskegon, Michigan. And anybody, I know some people here from Muskegon. Where are my Muskegon folks? Okay. And then I've spoken at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor a few times. Anybody from UMich here? Okay, great. So I love Michigan, and I'm glad to be back. And you actually even provided a little bit of snow for me last night. I hadn't seen snow since I moved back to Louisiana about 15 years ago, and so I saw snow. Okay, and so I want to start out with just a few reflection questions. And the first one is, what's the difference, if you think there's any difference at all between, and no, these are tutors, so I know you'll know there's a difference between teaching and tutoring. And the second question is, what do you think it is that students want you to do in a tutoring session? And then the third question is, what do you think students need you to do in a tutoring session? And so let's just take a minute or so to get your answers. Usually what I do in groups like this is, have you get your answer and then just kind of share with partners. But we're a small enough, intimate group that we can just share with the group. So take a few minutes, get your answers to that, and we'll see what we come up with as a group. Okay, you got it. So would someone share with us how you would characterize the difference between teaching and tutoring? Oh, and there are no right or wrong answers. Let me just say, there are no right or wrong answers to any questions. I think I'm going to use the handheld mic because I don't like it when I change my head direction and I think, let's see, is this going to, yeah, and the sound volume changes, so I'm just going to use this. Okay, so yes, we had a volunteer here. Okay, so in tutoring, you're not teaching new material. You are really kind of helping the student review what has already gone on in class. And so that means that we were expecting that students will have been to class, right? Okay, now, and I'm kind of serious here. How many of you have had a student come and say, oh, you do it so much better than the instructor. I don't go to class anymore. I just come here to get tutored. Anyway, yeah, okay. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is really let students know that it's important to go to class, because if they went to class and heard what was going on in class, what we do in a tutoring session is going to be that much more effective. And I really underestimated the number of students who just weren't going to class and really thought that what we did in a tutoring session was going to substitute for that. So great difference. Anybody else come up with another? Yes.
Learn in a tutoring session. Many times students don't know how to approach the material or even how to think through.
Okay, great. She's saying, yeah, in a tutoring session, it's really important that we help students learn how to learn the information, whereas that's not what's going on in a teaching session. In a teaching session, typically, they are providing the information that the students have to know. Okay, great. And, oh, yes?
I think it totally depends on the discipline, of course, that,
okay.
that the tutor is in. but for instance, I'm in writing and a student will come in and the instructor may just assume that the student knows how to find 3 outside sources. Many students do, but many students have zero ideas other than just Googling, which isn't a bad way. I do it myself. But, you know, we really need to teach them other ways of finding good sources and things like that. So that is new information in a way, because many instructors / professors assume students already know how to do that.
Right, and so what I hear you saying is that in a tutoring session, we really have the opportunity to find out individually where students are lacking, what they need, whereas in a teaching session, that's not going to happen, and recognizing that every student is different, and every student's need is, students need different things, and we can do that in a tutoring session. Great, okay. And if we look at the second question, what do you think most students want us to do in tutoring sessions?
Their work.
Okay, yeah, I know I didn't even need to take individual. People say do work, give them answers, show them how to work problems, and that's exactly the case. But what do students really need us to do in tutoring sessions?
Increase their understanding.
Okay, increase their understanding. What else? Yes.
Kind of teach them how to be a self-learner.
Okay, exactly. How to be a self-learner, how to learn the stuff themselves. Yes.
Install confidence in them.
Exactly, install confidence in them. Yep, I went to a great session earlier on math, and he talked about the importance of that. Yes.
Invite them to ask questions, not only the material, but also of their instructor, so they can, well, better learn the material.
Okay, I'm sorry. You said invite them to ask questions not only about the material, but also...
So, we'll ask the instructors about the material, too.
Got you. Okay. So in other words, teach them really and encourage them to talk with the instructor. And I'll get back to that in a minute because that's really important. Yes.
Make connections between concepts.
Absolutely. Making connections between concepts that they might not see. And I'll take one more. Yes.
Well, sometimes for drop-in type tutoring, when you're working with a lot of students, some of the students are already really good students and they know how to learn, but they just ran into a roadblock and they just need a second set of eyes to help them find, like, where did I go wrong? And, you know, a lot of times these are students who pretty much know what they're doing, but, but we all screw up sometimes, and sometimes it's hard to find your own mistakes.
Yeah. Okay. And that reminds me of, so she's saying really help them find the mistakes that they're making, because a lot of students are already very good and they're doing really good things, but they might have made a mistake and they need another set of eyes to look at what they've done to try to find those mistakes. Absolutely. All of those things, which I think most students, when they come to tutoring sessions, that's not really what they came for. And so I think it's important for us to help students understand what we can do as tutors, what we should be doing, and how that's really going to help them to help themselves become independent, self-directed learners. And so getting back to helping students understand that they need to talk with faculty, I think that's very important, but I also think that we need to prepare students for interacting with faculty. And this might seem a little strange, but when I encourage students to talk with faculty, I will ask the question, is this faculty member student-friendly or student-hostile? Do y'all know what I mean? Okay, yeah, there are some faculty who I think really hate students. Thankfully, maybe not a lot of them, but if we had cameras in the offices of all faculty members, we would be appalled by the treatment that students have gotten in office hours. Do y'all know what I mean? Yeah, and so once students have been told, well, you should have learned that in high school. Why don't you know that already? Or how did you miss it? You must not have studied at all for this test. That's not a good feeling, and students don't want to experience that again. And so I think it's very important for students to talk with faculty, but I think sometimes we have to prepare students for talking with faculty and how to let faculty know. Don't just go in saying, well, I have a question about problem number 3. Can you show me how to do it? But have done some work before they go in and say, I was thinking about problem number 3. This is what I've done. Am I on the right track? So that they give faculty members the idea that they are students who are willing to do the work, who want to do the work, but who just need some additional help. Okay, and so basically, since students are wanting something very different than we know is good for them, we really do have to help them close the gap between being those passive learners who want to just come in and have us give them information and active learners, because we all know that they don't. If we can explain stuff to them, they can be very passive, but if we do that, then they're not going to get the performance that they're looking for. But if they're active in the session and they become self-directed and independent, then they're going to get the kind of performance that they're looking for. And so basically what we're talking about is turning students into expert learners. And the idea of experts versus novices actually comes from the cognitive science literature, where they studied the behavior of experts and novices in a number of disciplines. And I'll just give you one example, chess players. They looked at expert chess players, which were chess masters, and then the novice chess players were players who'd been playing for about 6 months or so. And they showed the two groups a chessboard where there were pieces on the board, and they asked them to describe what they saw. And the two groups described the chessboard totally differently. The novices explained what pieces were on the board and the configuration that those pieces were in, and they did that very well. But the experts, on the other hand, didn't spend any time talking about that. They spent time talking about the series of moves that probably brought the chessboard to its current configuration, or the series of moves that would take it from that configuration to either check or checkmate. So they were looking at exactly the same thing, but seeing different things. Another comparison was with physics students and physics professors, where they gave them a problem that was outside the area of expertise of the physics faculty, and they gave the two groups a problem, and they noticed that they went about it totally different ways. What do you think the physics students wanted? No, not quite the answer yet. They knew it was an exercise where they had to solve these problems. But what do many of our students want? If they have a problem to do, they always want us to give, or they want to look up the procedure, the formula. They were starting with, what formula should I use? Whereas the faculty members, on the other hand, were looking at what concept does this problem entail? And they were going to get the formula to use based on the concept, because they recognized that if you apply the wrong formula to a concept, then you're not going to get anything useful. Whereas the students were not really understanding that it's a concept that's more important. They were going straight to the formula. And so if we teach students how to learn by teaching them these metacognitive learning strategies, but also, and we talked a little bit earlier in the session that I went to, and we're talking about motivation. How do we motivate students? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now and a little bit more in the breakout session later. So I do have some outcomes that I'd like for us to get from our brief time together this morning. I want us to identify some of the challenges that tutors face, and I think the number one is that what students want and what we need to give them are very different. We'll understand how important metacognition. Students develop independence, and I want you to have very, very concrete strategies that you can use to increase your effectiveness as a tutor when it comes to teaching students how to learn. I want our students, or your students, to take more responsibility for their own learning. And I want us to view students differently. When I started tutoring, in fact, up until about 10 years ago, I used to think that there were certain students who were smart and certain students who were not so smart. And it was the smart students who did very well and maybe didn't need a lot of help. I now no longer believe that. I don't believe in the concept of smart students and students who are not smart. I think that there are students who've learned strategies and who use those strategies effectively for success. And then there are students who don't know strategies and are not successful. And the surprise to me over these 13 years that I've been doing this is how easy it is to teach the students who are not successful to be successful. And then when they're successful, then they change their self-image and they are much more motivated. And so now I view students as everybody can be a very good student. It's just that some students don't have the strategies, and that's why strategies are so important. And then finally, I want us and our students to have a more satisfying experience, because how many of you have ever been frustrated by some of the students who come to your tutoring sessions? Anybody ever been frustrated? Okay, yeah. When we see that they are just negative about the subject, or just seem to have this attitude that there's no way I can do this, and that's just very frustrating. And so I think with these strategies, then we'll be able to decrease that level of frustration on both our part and our students' part. And so now what I want to do is kind of take you through the process that I go through with students to really help them understand how if they change their behaviors and attitudes, then that will go a long way in improving their performance. And so the first question that I ask is, what's the difference? If you think there's any difference at all, you might think they're the same thing, but what's the difference between studying and learning? And typically when I ask students this, they haven't really thought about it before, but they'll think about it, and they come up with some very good answers. And so let me just ask out there, if you think about the difference between studying and learning, how would you characterize the difference? Anybody? Yes.
Studying is going over content, like you're reviewing the content that you know, and learning is when you're trying to learn new concepts or ideas.
Oh, okay, okay. So he said studying is kind of going over the concepts and things you know, and then learning is learning new stuff, getting new ideas. Okay. And I saw a few other hands. Yes.
Learning is more about the retention, being able to retain it on the road, whereas studying is kind of more, at least to me, the initial, the first time you're experiencing it, trying to get to the retention.
Oh, okay, so he said that learning is actually being able to retain what you know, use it down the road, but studying may be kind of the first part of just trying to get it down. Okay, anybody? Okay, here and then here. Yes.
Studying is more memorizing.
Okay.
And learning is actually the cognitive understanding of it.
Okay, and that's actually the number one answer I get from students. They say, you know, studying is just memorizing information for a test or a quiz, whereas learning is understanding. Yes?
Mine was along the same vein, where studying is just memorizing or learning what the concepts are, but learning is actually being able to apply those concepts and problem solving.
Yes, and they've told me variations of what we've heard, and sometimes they say, well, studying is short-term, learning is long-term. Sometimes they'll say, well, studying is tedious, you know, learning is fun. But the most common answer I get is that studying is just memorizing information for a test or a quiz, whereas learning is being able to apply that information and use it later on. And then when I ask them, up to this point, have you been more in study mode or in learn mode, what do you think they tell me? Study. Study mode, exactly. They don't even know there's a learn mode to be in. And so if we can have this conversation with our students so that they know that there's another mode to be in, and we can teach them how to do that, then it really empowers students to recognize that they don't have to be in study mode. But if we don't have that discussion with them, they won't know how to do anything differently. And then the second question I asked, and I'll ask you guys, let's say I was going to give you two tasks and ask you, would you work harder for one than the other? And if so, which would you work harder for? So task one, I might say, 2 weeks from now, we will have finished the first 3 chapters, and we're going to have a test on that information, and you have to make an A on that test. That's task one. Task 2, I might say 2 weeks from now, we'll have finished the first 3 chapters, and I'm going to give a test, but I've decided that the day before the test, I'm going to conduct a review session, and you're going to teach that review session. So I'm going to have you come up to the front of the class, and you're going to explain all of the concepts, paying particular attention to the difficult concepts to make sure that everybody is prepared for the test the next day. Would you work harder for one of those than the other? Okay, and which would you work harder for? B. Okay, and were you about to say something?
Yes, I would work harder for B because if I could do B effectively, I would be better prepared to do A effectively.
Okay.
Because if I understand the material and can teach it to others, that means that I myself probably understand it well also.
Okay.
So I have a better chance of getting it A.
Exactly. And that's what students say. Now, some of them say, well, you know, the test really determines my grade in the class, but how I teach it may not be that important to, but 90% of the students say, I would work harder to teach it. And then when I ask, well, why would you work harder? It's along those lines, but most of the simple answers, they say, well, I got to really understand it if I have to teach it. And not realizing that they really do have to understand it if they're going to make an A on the test, because that has not been the experience of most of our students. Most of them have been in high school experiences or other experiences where if they were good memorizers, they did pretty well. And so then when I ask them, up to this point, which mode have you been in, A or B? What do you think they tell me? A. They've been in A mode. They've been studying for the test. And so then I kind of make a little joke out of it and say, the good news is you don't have to have your own class to be in scenario B mode. If you got empty chairs in your room, if you have stuffed animals, if you have imaginary friends, if you have any audience that you can pretend that you're teaching this information to, it's huge. And the reason this works is this. Now ask us here, has anybody ever had the experience where you thought you understood something totally and you started to explain it to somebody and then you kind of realize, oh, I don't really understand this part. Has that ever happened? Okay, and then what do you do when that happens? You go and you look up what you didn't understand, right? And this is what students tell me. But the point is, if you hadn't been explaining that information, you never would have known that you didn't totally understand it until when I do this with students, I ask you wouldn't have known you didn't understand it until when? Till the test or the quiz. And so absolutely, so that's why so many of our students go into a test or a quiz thinking, I know everything, I knew it. It just flew out of my head when I sat down to take the test. Well, no, that didn't really happen, but they're not aware that they didn't totally know it. And so I've had students tell me that, they got a whiteboard, a lot of graduate students, because I do these talks to grad students, med school students, dental school students, law school students, because most of them haven't learned these concepts either. But they'll say, I went out and bought a whiteboard. Sometimes students say, well, I just went to the class, an empty classroom and pretended to teach it. And so that's where you can learn what you haven't mastered and go over and do that. And so this is very important for students to understand. And so to help our students excel, we've got to help them stay in learn mode and not be in study mode, and also help them study as if they've got to teach the information. Now, I see people taking notes, and that's absolutely great. Feel free to keep taking notes, but I'm going to make this whole PowerPoint presentation available to you in PowerPoint form. So if you want to take some of the slides and modify them as you want to and use them with your students, then that's absolutely fine. And so what I want to do now is tell you briefly about 3 students. And these were students that we worked with. And I want to tell you the strategies that we used. The scores that are not in red are the scores that they got before we started working. And then the scores that are underlined in red are the scores that they got afterwards. And again, let me just say that I was shocked. I didn't know that these strategies would be that effective with students. Well, now the first one was Travis, who was a psychology student, and he'd made a 47 on the first test and a 52 on the second test. And I talked with him actually by phone. Let me turn this other one off. I talked with him by phone about 30 minutes before the third test. And I thought he would make in the low to mid 70s because I knew he'd do a lot better. But I was shocked when he called me up and he said, Dr. McGuire, I made an 82. And I said, wow, Travis, that's fantastic. If you make higher than N, and I was trying to think of a score that he wouldn't make higher than. I wanted to give him a stretch score. And I said, if you make higher than an 85 on your next test, I will take you to lunch. And so he calls back, about 3 weeks later, Dr. McGuire made 86. And so I said, wow, that's great. Let me get back to you and set a lunch date. So I called the professor to verify that this self-reported 86 was actually an 86. And she said, yeah, he made 86. So I took him to lunch and I said, Travis, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm just doing that stuff you told me to do. And what I told Travis, it's a reading strategy. Many of our students need to be able to read effectively their textbooks, and most of them don't have good reading skills. And so I had so many students at LSU telling me that they were having difficulty with reading. Could I teach them reading strategies? And I was a chemistry professor. I didn't know how to teach people how to read. But I found this 4-week workshop over the summer, and that was supposed to teach. It started from kindergarten all the way through adults to teach you how to read. And so I said, oh, well, maybe I'll take this thing and see if I can get some strategies. It was priceless. What I learned at that workshop is the main reason that people don't remember a lot of what they read is you start to read and your mind starts to wander. And so you're reading, but then your mind starts to wander, and you're not realizing that, oh, I'm not paying attention, until you get a few pages in. And then when you realize, oh, I wasn't paying attention, I don't know what I just read, what do you do at that point?
Keep reading.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, because I heard something that's very different than I usually hear. I heard 2 answers. I heard somebody say go back. I heard somebody say keep reading. So now we're going to do this by show of hands. How many of you then go back and backtrack? Okay. How many of you just keep reading? Okay. Well, this strategy may help you a lot. but there are people who keep reading. If they have a really good background in the information, you know, and they already know it, maybe they can keep reading. But if you haven't understood, then going ahead is not going to really do a lot of good, because you need to understand as you go along. Okay, so we learned the way to prevent that. The way to prevent that is to use the way the brain operates most effectively. If the brain has a big picture, if it has an overview of what it's about to learn, and then it gets details to fill in that big picture, it's much more efficient than if it just starts out getting individual details and trying to create its own big picture from the details. And so we need to give the brain an overview of what it's about to learn. And you can do that by looking at the boldface print, the italicized words, any charts or graphs. You know, just pick a few pages, small section, and look at that so your brain has got the big picture. But then you come up with questions that you want the reading to answer for you. So you're giving yourself a purpose for doing the reading. So if I were reading a chapter on acids and bases, I might see strong acid, weak acid as two of the italicized phrases. And so I would say, well, I wonder what this reading is going to say is the difference between strong acids and weak acids. So now when I'm reading for a purpose. And then the next thing, though, which is really important, is when you start to read, just read one paragraph. Only one paragraph. Stop, put that information in your own words. You can jot down some notes if you want to, but you don't have to do that. Just put it in your own words. And then read the second paragraph, stop, put that in your own words, and try to fold in what was in the first paragraph. Do the third paragraph the same way. Now, when I talk to students, I always ask, that sounds like it's going to take a long time to get through the reading, doesn't it? They always say, yeah. But in point of fact, every student, and when students come back, I ask them, you know, because they'll come back and they'll say, wow, that reading thing is really helpful. And I'll ask them, does it take you longer to do the reading this way than it was taking you before? And they'll say, well, no, actually, it takes me less time to do it this way. And so I ask them, why does it take you less time now? And what do you think they tell me? Why would it take them less time doing it this way?
They don't have to go back.
Exactly. And when I'm explaining it to students who haven't tried it, I tell them this, and that's exactly what they say. They don't have to go back. So the old way, what they were doing is read a little bit, go back, read, go back, read, go back, read, go back. But this way, you're moving more slowly through the material, but you get to the end point faster because you're not rereading. And the other thing that happens is, can you imagine once you get to the 5th page, if you've understood everything that's in pages 1 through 4, then you are going to stay on the 5th page much better. So you focus in a lot better. The other thing that happens is your brain gets the idea. By about the 3rd paragraph, it says, okay, she's going to stop, make me put this stuff in my own words. And so it focuses in on the information with the idea of how it's going to paraphrase it. And so you can get much more focused. And as you see, Travis ended up with a B in the course. And I've taught, as I said, many graduate students, law school students are also using this. Now, Dana and Joshua, their problem was pretty much the same. And even though 90% of the stuff we're talking about now, I did not know when I was at Cornell University, and I taught there for 12 years. But this one thing that we're going to talk about now, I did learn at Cornell. The #1 reason that my students in chemistry, who could have been making A's and B's in the class, were making D's and F's on tests was because of this one thing, and it was because of the way they were doing their homework. And I'm going to ask you to think back to your own experience as students, and I'm going to ask if you've ever done this, raise your hand, and my hand will be the first one to go up. When you had a homework assignment, and so you looked at the problem, read the problem, and then flipped back in the chapter to find an example of the problem that you had to work, and use the example as a guide. If you've ever done that, raise your hand. Ah, okay. All of our students are doing that. And, okay, yes. And I help them understand by taking them through a discussion how that's detrimental to their performance on tests. And so I'll ask us, when we looked at the example, were we doing the problem? No. And I asked, what was doing the problem? The book, the example, the textbook author. But when you get to a test or a quiz, the #1 thing that a professor is trying to determine is, can a student look at a problem they have never seen before? Can they start it, go all the way through it, and finish it without a single external aid? And at LSU, we give multiple choice tests. So if you make one mistake, then you're not going to get any of the answers. And so you don't even get partial credit for the stuff that you do know. And so nobody on the planet could do that if you've never practiced that skill. And if you're only using the examples to turn in your homework, then you're not practicing that skill. So what do we tell them to do instead? What we tell them to do is, before you look at the first problem, you have to study the information that the problem set is covering. Pick, 3 or 4, and whatever that section is, study that information. Study it as if you're going to have a test or a quiz on it the very next day. So just focus in. And when you're doing that, whether you're using the textbook or your notes, you are going to come across examples. And then I ask students, right now, what do you do when you get to an example when you're studying? And I see some smiles out there, so I think people know what students tell me they do when they get to an example. And what is that? Skip it. Yeah. Now that surprised me because I never skipped the examples. I would read the problem and look at what the author did, even when I was reading the chapter. But our students now are skipping the examples. And so then I tell them that you've got to commit to yourself that you will never skip another example, because the examples are your brain's best resource for understanding, for convincing itself that it can do these problems without any external aids. It doesn't need to use the example. Okay, so what you have to do instead is study the information. When you get to the example, just read the problem statement. Work the problem yourself. Work it all the way until you get to it. You might get to a point where you're not sure exactly what to do next, but just think of something to do. Just power your way through it until you get to an answer. And then once you've gotten to an answer, compare your answer with the answer that's in the book. If you got the same answer, now you can look at what the author did. But if you didn't get the same answer, don't look yet. Try to figure out where your mistake was. And then I ask students, at this point in the process, do you think making a mistake is good or bad? And what do you think students tell me? Do you think students tell me at this point making a mistake is good or bad? Okay, now I was so hoping you guys, since you're tutors, that you would give me an answer that is what students say. But I should know that since you're such good students, you're more like faculty. So, okay, and I've asked this question because I speak a lot, and whenever I ask faculty, what do you think students say? Faculty always say bad. Whenever I ask students, do you think making a mistake at this point is good or bad? Students always say good. And then I say, and I'm not saying it's bad if you don't make a mistake. I mean, it's great if you don't make a mistake at this point. But why is it good if you make a mistake at this point? And what do you think they tell me? Exactly. It shows you what you don't know. It shows you where your brain is likely to make a mistake. That's one of the things they say. What else do you think they say? Absolutely. They say you learn from your mistakes. What do you think another thing is they say? Yes.
Mistake now than on the exam.
Absolutely. They say you don't lose points if you make a mistake now. Better to make a mistake now than on the exam. Absolutely. And I went to a great session, as I said earlier. Wonderful job. And he was talking about the importance of allowing students to make mistakes. And I think if we help students understand that mistakes are not bad, then that would really be helpful for them. Because right now, students think, you would think that students think of mistakes as very bad because of the way they've been penalized for mistakes in the past. But when we frame it in this way, asking them that way, then they say, that mistakes are not bad at all. Now, the other thing, how many of you have ever had students who said, oh, I would have done so well on that test, but I just made simple mistakes? Anybody have students say that? Yeah, I just made simple mistakes. And so I help students understand that I say, my attitude is there are no such thing as simple mistakes. Mistakes look simple in retrospect. Once you know what the right thing is, your mistake looks so simple. But mistakes are things that have to be made. And so either you're going to make them during this process at this point, or you're going to make them on the test or the quiz. You choose. And that has motivated a lot of students to actually make sure that they will go through and do it the way we're talking about. Okay, so we're still talking about the examples. So after you've done the examples this way, you've corrected all your mistakes, then when you get to the actual homework problem, do 2 or 3 and pretend you're in a test situation. And so you're kind of speeding up the clip, because some students run out of time on tests because they've never tried to do things quickly when they're doing the homework. But if they speed it up and without looking at anything, do 3 or 4 of them like you're on a test. And then after you've done those, then check to make sure you haven't made any mistakes, and then turn in your homework. And Dana and Joshua, you see the kind of scores they made. I met Dana, actually. She was a physics major. She'd always wanted to do medical physics, and I met her when she was about to leave physics. And she was at a Change Your Major workshop. I wasn't teaching the workshop. I just went to see what they tell people in a Change Your Major workshop. And Dana said that she'd come to do physics, but physics was not working out. And the counselor said, "Oh yeah, I know physics is hard. We'll find you something you can do." But I asked her if she had an hour to, when we were leaving together, if she could just come to the office and talk for an hour. And I told her I was not going to try to talk her out of leaving physics, because if she wanted to leave physics, that was perfectly fine if she wanted to do something else. But I wanted her to know she was leaving not because she couldn't do it, but because she had chosen to do something else. She stayed in, got an A in the course, 4.0 that semester. She's now in her 2nd year at MD Anderson Cancer Center doing a master's in physics on a fellowship. And so this kind of stuff actually gives students back their hopes and dreams. Okay, so how did they do it? They became expert learners. They became very strategic by using metacognition. So they really started studying to learn as opposed to making a grade. And so I actually explained to students exactly what metacognition is. It's a term that was coined by a cognitive scientist back in 1976, and it's your ability, and this is kind of a simplified definition, but I want to use a definition that students can understand, that they can really internalize. So basically, it's your ability to think about your own thinking. The way I explain it to students is, it's as if you've got a big brain outside your brain looking at what your brain is doing. And that big brain is saying, is she just memorizing this information for a test or a quiz, or does she know it well enough that she could teach it to someone else? It's your ability to know that you are a problem solver. You don't need other people to answer all of the questions for you. If you have a question about a procedure in math, and you don't know how to do something, then certainly you could say, well, I gotta go and ask the tutor for that. Or what's a wonderful resource that's online that students can use to get information about topics? Google. I'm hearing 2 things that are absolutely right. Somebody said the book, and somebody said Khan Academy. Absolutely. And so I encourage students to use both of those. But how many people here are aware that there are actually faculty members who tell students you don't really need to buy the book? Yeah. Did y'all know that? Okay, how many students have actually been in a class where the professor has said you don't really need to buy the book? Yeah. Okay, so I also help students understand why those professors are lying to them. And I tell them that. I said, those professors are lying to you. And I said, but don't get mad at them, because they don't know they're lying to you. They're saying that because they don't want you to spend all the money. But then when you think about it, what's more expensive, the textbook or flunking the course? Or if you're a pre-med student, the textbook or getting a C in the course that may keep you out of medical school. And so to help them really understand, what I do is I just draw a C, a blank, and a T. And I ask, what's the first word that comes to mind when you see that? And what do you think they tell me? Cat. Yeah, sometimes they say cot, sometimes they say cut. That's fine, any of them. Most times they say cat. And I said, absolutely. But if we lived in a culture that had no cats, and you didn't see cats growing up, would that word have popped into your head? And they say no. And so I said, the way the brain operates is, if it sees something that it's very familiar with, large chunks of it could be left out, could be missing, but your brain automatically fills in the missing pieces. That's why you can read those text messages with all the letters left out. That's why you can read those license plates. And so, and I asked them, well, what are you supposed to use if the professor says, you don't really need to buy the book in this course, what are you supposed to use to learn from instead? The professor's notes, absolutely, the professor's notes. Well, the professor's notes, the reason that they don't have as many pages as the chapter in the book is because that's the equivalent of the C, the blank, and the T. And I ask students, does, let's say for trigonometry, does your brain have anything that it can fill in the missing points in the notes? And they say no. And the other question is, when the professor looks at the notes and says everything is in the notes, are they seeing what their mind sees in the notes or what your mind sees in the notes? And of course, it's what their mind sees. Then I ask, when the professor writes the test, are they writing the test based on what their mind sees in the notes or what your mind sees in the notes? what their mind sees. And that's why so often students say, well, we never went over that. We didn't talk about that. And the professor says, yeah, it is. It's right there in the notes. Well, it's not what the student sees in the notes. And so we have to encourage students to use the textbook, to buy the textbook and use it, and maybe even give that example to help them understand why that's so important. It's your ability not just to monitor your mental processing, but to control it, and also to accurately judge the level at which you're learning. And that's the problem with so many students, where they spent hours and hours, and they'll tell us, I spent so much time on this, but they were just memorizing stuff. And when they get to the test is at the application level. And so, oh, okay, yeah, I want to, there are a couple of slides that show exactly what the problem was and what the solution was, but I want to revisit Travis for a little bit, because the two steps, previewing the text before reading and developing questions, is what psychologists call developing an anticipatory set. And so I want to do a little exercise with you. I'm going to show a passage. I'm going to give you about a minute to read it. You don't have to finish the whole thing, but I want you to read it and see if I asked you to paraphrase that at the end if you could. So let's start reading this. Yeah, I'm seeing some frowns and some kind of weird, isn't it? Okay, but what if you knew that this passage was about Christopher Columbus discovering America? If you read it again, does it make more sense?
Yes.
Absolutely. Now we know what the forging along through calm vastness, we know what that is. Yeah, so it makes a big difference. And actually, I apologize to anybody who thinks this is politically correct. I got this exercise from a book, and the last time I presented it as is, someone came up to me and said, you know, you really should change that Christopher Columbus discovering America. And I'd actually changed it to Christopher Columbus's first voyage. But I see that the one I inserted here had discovering America, and of course we know he didn't discover America. America was already here. But I use this, and so this is a way to help students see that if I preview information before I read, it can make a huge difference, and this is the source right here. Because as you know, a lot of what we're trying to do is motivate students to use the strategies that we're teaching them to use, and sometimes having them go through this makes a lot of sense. Okay, now it's also the case that anticipatory set can interfere with learning. And so if we look at the car on the next slide, and I'm going to ask you, is that a two-door car or a four-door car? Looks like a two-door car. But it's got four doors. Exactly. It looks like a two-door car, but it's got four doors. Okay, yeah, I rented this car on one of my last trips, and I get this car and I'm thinking, is this like a police car and they don't want you to be able to open the back seat or something? But actually, because my anticipatory set said that the handle for the back should be in a comparable position here. But actually, if you look very carefully, there's the handle for the back door. And yeah, it's here. Okay, and so the way this translates into what we do with tutoring, a lot of times students come with misconceptions. And if we are not having our students explain to us what they see in situations, when I first started tutoring, I was just in explain mode. I wanted to explain things. I didn't realize that students came with misconceptions that they couldn't get past if I was just explaining what I was explaining. And so we have to spend time with students trying to find out, you know, what they might be thinking. And so I want to do a little exercise with you now that shows, you know, how students can really significantly improve their performance rapidly and quickly. And so I want to see how accurately you can count the vowels on the next slide. And so I'm going to give you 45 seconds to do it. If you finish before 45 seconds are up, then just go back and make sure that you've gotten exactly the right number of vowels. But we all have to stop at 45 seconds, and I'll give you the 5-second warning. Everybody ready? Okay, so let's start counting the vowels now. 5 seconds. And stop. Okay, so now what I want to know is how many of the words or phrases on the slide you remember. And in the interest of time, I won't do what I normally go through, is I just have people raise their hand. But the average typically is about 3. And I'll just ask, how many people remembered fewer than 3, you think? Okay, how many people more than 3? Okay, about 3. Yeah. Okay, and so now I want you to look at the words again. And if you look at them from top to bottom, you're going to see that they are arranged according to things. And if you haven't seen this before, I know a few people have seen this before. If you haven't seen it before, as soon as you recognize what they're arranged according to, then just yell it out. Numbers, exactly. Dollar bill for 1, dice for 2, tricycle for 3, 4-leaf clover, hand, 6-pack, etc. And so now what I'm going to do is give you 45 seconds to memorize the words or short phrases. And this time when I say time's up, I want you to just close your eyes and silently recite the words to yourself to see how many you remember this time around. And we'll see what we come up with. Okay, so let's start memorizing the words now. Five seconds. And stop. So just close your eyes and silently repeat them to you, go over them, and then open your eyes when you think you've remembered as many as you're going to remember. Okay, it looks like most people have finished. Did you do better that time? Yeah. Okay, now the average when I do this is usually about 12 the second time, but some people remember 6, 7, 8, but even if you remembered only 6 or 7, if you got 1 or 2 the first time, that's still about 4 times better than you did the first time. And so you can make significant progress. And so, because if you did 4 times as good as the first time, then that means if you got a 20 on the first test, you could make an 80 on the second test. But the key is there were 2 major differences between the first and second attempt. Yes?
How many vowels were there?
Oh, very good. Okay, yes. How many vowels were there?
52.
Actually 50. There were 50. We weren't counting the Y's, but there were 50 vowels on there, just the A-I-O-U's. Yes, thanks for asking that. I often forget to say it. But there were 2 major differences between the first and the second attempt. What was one of the major differences? The focus. We knew what the task was. I told you count the vowels the first time. I didn't want to know the vowels. I wanted to know what the words were. The way this plays out with our students is they think, as I did, when the professor gave the homework assignment, I thought the task was to turn in a correctly done set of problems. That wasn't the task at all. The professor wanted us to know how to work the problems that were on the homework. And so we have to make sure that our students understand what the task is. If it's to read a chapter, it's not just to have your eyes kind of fall over every word, it's to be able to discuss what's in this chapter, to understand it. So we knew what the task was, and then what was the other major difference? Okay, seeing the whole picture in, what did somebody over here say? Oh, details. Okay, so that's related. We knew how the information was organized. We had the overall picture. We knew it was a number. And now that's the other thing. So let's say, okay, what the task was, and we knew how the information was organized. we had a framework within which to connect this information. And we know from psychology that in fact, this is the way the brain operates. Whenever it's trying to learn something new, it's always trying to relate it to something that it already knows. And if you can relate new information to something that you already know that's familiar, then that's called it's an anchor. And so it's much easier to remember that information and to learn from it because you've now anchored that information to something that's very familiar. And if we teach our students how to do that, I mean, we could just ask them, if we're talking about something in a session, just asking, well, does that remind you of anything? It doesn't have to be related to the subject matter. Just does it remind you of anything at all? And whatever that relationship is, if they can make those connections, then it will make a big difference. And so we can turn our students into efficient expert learners, but we also have to constantly help them ask the why and what if questions. And I forgot to mention earlier on, the question about the difference between studying and learning. When I was talking with a group of dental school students, one young man said, well, the difference for me is this. He said, studying is focusing on the whats, but learning is focusing on the whys, the hows, and the what ifs. And I find that if I focus on the whats, if I learn the whats, just the whats and forget the whats, I can't recreate them. But if I focus on the whys, the hows, and the what ifs, even if I forget the whats, I can recreate them. And so I think in our tutoring sessions, what we've got to do is help students focus on the why is it that the atoms decreases if you go from left to right on the periodic table, but increases as you go from top to bottom. And so we're helping them now to see the underlying structure of the information. Have them test their information by practicing retrieval of information during the tutoring session. Have them explain stuff to you. Let them know, next time you come, I'm going to ask you to teach me this information so that they can focus in on it. And then help them move their activities higher on Bloom's taxonomy. Now, is there anybody who's not familiar with Bloom's taxonomy? Okay, how many of us, okay, one or two people, how many of us have actively taught Bloom's to our students? Only one or two. I'm going to strongly encourage you to teach Bloom's to your students, even if you just, have just a little handout, just this little handout, copy it, give them to it. I find that when I explain Bloom's, it's just a hierarchy of learning levels, going from straight just memorizing information to being able to paraphrase information, put it in your own words, to being able to answer questions, solve problems you've never seen before, up to taking any concept, breaking it into simpler concepts, to evaluating, making judgments on different theories, different ideas, to creating, coming up with your own ideas. And even though at this site they break it up in high school, undergraduate, and graduate school, I usually take these off because that's not necessarily the case. Many students in high school have gone up here. Many students in the first year in college, they're doing peer evaluations. And if they're doing peer evaluations, that's up there at evaluating. But the utility of this with students is most times they are not even aware that there are these different learning levels. And so when we tell them, we want you to think at higher levels, that's Greek to them. They have no idea that there are levels. And so whenever I show this to students, they go like, wow, I really wish I'd known this in high school. So we actually help them understand what they need to do. And when we teach students about Bloom's, they really get it. When I asked students, and I was using clickers, and so I have the data, but when I asked students, at what level did you typically have to operate on Bloom's in high school, what level do you think they told me? Okay, yeah, usually they tell me the first two levels. And this group, 44% the first level, 29% comprehension, very few. And so what I try to do with students is help them understand that the reason that they're not doing well in class is not because they're not smart. Because many times students come and they think, I'm just not smart anymore, I can't do this. No, it was because they were doing the wrong thing. It's not about how smart you are, it's about your behavior. And so if you were in study mode, if you were working to make an A on the test, if you were operating at lower levels of Bloom's, that's why you're not doing well. But then when I ask them, what level do you think you'll need to be at to make A's in this chemistry course, this was general chemistry, that you're perfectly capable of doing, what level do you think they told me? Anybody have any idea? Just yell it out. 4, okay, absolutely. What you're gonna see is most of them recognized that they needed to be at least level 4. And so what that means is when we have this discussion with students, now they see what they were doing wrong. But I did not ever used to teach students blooms. I knew about blooms because my PhD is actually in chemical education, but I never taught it to blooms. But when I got to LSU, they were doing it very successfully. And then when I started doing it, I just started seeing the light bulbs go on, that students recognized that they needed to go to higher levels. But then we've got to show them how to do that. And so the question is, how do you teach students to go to the next higher level? Well, we call it the study cycle, and it's just a 5-step process where the first step is to preview the information that's going to be covered in class before you go to class. We want to give your brain that big picture of what the professor is going to talk about. It takes about 10 minutes to do this. You look at the bold-face print, italicized words, your charts or graphs, and I tell students to use the textbook to do this. And this is where I discovered that there were so many faculty members telling students they didn't need to buy the book, because when I would tell them how to preview, they'd say, oh, he said we don't have to have the book. It's like, what? And I have talked with faculty, and I'll go and ask faculty, because students tell me who it is. And I'll say, well, why do you tell them they don't need to use a book? And they'll tell me, well, books are too expensive. And then I say, did you use a book when you took this course? And what do you think they tell me? Of course they did, exactly. And so they don't see that as they benefit. Students need to also. So we tell them to preview the information before you go to class, and then go to class. And so one of the things as tutors, I think we have to constantly ask students, did you go to class? I was assuming that students were going to class until I started asking. And then I found out that they said, well, no, because I get so much more out of this. And so we have to constantly reinforce with students that going to class is extremely important. And if you've done your previewing, you can use that hour in class as a learning hour. You're not sitting there just taking dictation, but you are following the instructor. You can answer the questions they throw out because you are engaged in the lecture. So you got to go to class. And then the third step is to, as soon after class as possible, review what happened in class. And that's important because when you hear something for the first time, what part of memory does it go into? Short-term, or sometimes psychologists call it working memory. Exactly. If you don't do something to move it into long-term memory, that information is going to be lost to you after a little while. And it's related to, and I'll ask us here, I ask students, how many of you have ever seen a movie, any movie, more than one time? Okay. How many people have noticed that the second time you see the movie, you see things that you didn't even know were there the first time? And I tell students it's exactly the same thing with learning. Your brain, when you review this information, your brain is going to drill down to the next lower level. You're going to see things that you didn't even know were there. You didn't even hear it the first time. So you've got to do the review. It takes about 10 minutes to do that. Sometimes students say that they just, if there's not another class coming in, they just stay in class and review. Sometimes they say they get to class early for the preview. Some of them do it the night before. Doesn't matter when you do it. You just got to do it. But you do have to do more than just the preview, 10-minute preview and 10-minute review. You got to do intense studying, and we call it intense study sessions. And we actually show them how to break that up. You take about a minute or so to set a goal for what you want to accomplish. And then you spend the next 30 to 50 to 60 to 75 minutes or so accomplishing that goal. And we explain to students that it's really important not to do these marathon study sessions because your brain will get tired and less efficient even though you're not necessarily sensing it. So don't spend more than about 75 minutes. Sometimes I have students who say, well, I got ADHD. I can't study for 30 minutes. I said, fine, can you do 12 minutes? Well, yeah, I can do that. Okay, set a goal for a minute, study for 10 minutes, review for a minute, but just do more frequent ones of that. And then after that amount of time, then just reward yourself, take a break, and then review, go over what you've just studied. And we tell students, if you can do 2 or 3 of these during the day, and another 1 or 2 at night, you will have studied 4 hours that day. Because that's the other big thing with many of our students. They're just not spending any time on this stuff. And so, but they have breaks that they could be doing this, but they kind of tell themselves, well, I need 3 hours. And so they have these, hour breaks during classes or even 45 minutes, and they're not using it productively. What are they doing for my students out there? What are they doing on these short breaks? What are they checking? Facebook, Instagram, texting, but they can use those. And so we have to show students how to use that time productively. And so metacognitive strategies are really important because they really do empower students to learn even after people have convinced them, and they've convinced themselves that they're not able to learn the information, because they can see now why they weren't being successful. They have a concrete reason why, and then they know what to do differently. And so they can help students develop a different mindset. And at the first session, I thought you were going to give my plenary, but there are two different mindsets. And okay, so we're going to get to that in a little bit. But this is an email that I got from a student in April of 2011, a month before the semester ended. And he was emailing me saying, I'm not so good in chemistry. I'm not doing well in the course. Can you tutor me? Well, I didn't spend a nanosecond tutoring this guy. I spent an hour in the office talking with him about learning strategies, and he ended up with an A in the course, 87, 87, 97 on the final. And I always ask students, what did you do differently? And I urge you to ask your students, because you have students, you already have students who were not doing well, and then they started working with you, and they started doing much better. And so if you ask students, what did you do specifically differently, then you can use that with other students as a motivation tool. But he says, what I did different was make side notes in each chapter. So now he's using the book. This guy didn't even know there was a book for the course when I first talked with him. I asked him, what's the name of the book? He said, oh, there is no book for the course. And I got really mad at the instructor because this guy has very extensive notes. And I'm thinking, now he's telling him that it's not even a book for the course. But then I'm thinking, well, no, that doesn't make too much sense. And so I asked him to email me the syllabus. He emailed the syllabus, and I looked at it. The book was there, but it was under recommended. And so the guy never even looked at it because he knew he was only going to do the required stuff. So after he got the book, he made side notes in each chapter, and as I progressed into the next chapter, I was able to refer to these notes. I would say that in chemistry, everything builds from the previous topic. And so we as tutors and faculty know this, but this is not something that students know automatically. And so great strategies for helping students learn how to learn. Establish expectations and ground rules. And I noticed on the Davenport, on the tutor homepage, it said what students need to do. They need to bring their materials. They need to have gone over the information. They need to, there's a bunch of stuff they need to do. And I think if we really stress that with our students, it's going to make a big difference. Attributing failures to correctable causes and success to effective strategies. So you didn't fail this test because the test was too hard, because the instructor was bad, but it was because you didn't do the things that were necessary to do in order to master the material. So help them take responsibility. And then encourage students to form study groups, because it's in these study groups that they can actually discuss information. And a lot of you I know are SI leaders, and those are great venues for people to do this. Metacognitive get acquainted activity. What do you believe is important to understand and learn in this particular subject? You could do that in a tutoring session. What do you believe to be critical characteristics of successful students? How are you going to study and prepare for exams in Spanish or in philosophy, in history, so that you can get students to start thinking about what they will have to do, their active role in the process. And so these are the books on mindset, where Dweck found that typically students, or just people in general, have one of two ideas about intelligence. Either they think that your intelligence is fixed, you're kind of born with a certain amount of it, and if you have an IQ test in 3rd grade and your IQ is 70, when you get to 10th grade, if they test you again, it's not going to be 120. But the other view is that you can grow your intelligence with your actions. Oh, and this is a great book too, David Schenck, The Genius in All of Us, Why Everything You've Been Told About Genetics, Talent, and IQ is Wrong. And so these are the two mindsets that Dweck has found that most people have. The other view is that you can grow your intelligence with what you do. So you very well could have a 70 in 3rd grade and 120 in 10th grade if you did those things that grew your intelligence. And we know from studies and things like brain plasticity that the growth intelligence mindset is much closer to being accurate. But do you think most students have intelligence mindset or growth intelligence mindset? Absolutely fixed, yeah. They saw those groups in 3rd grade, the blue, the green group, the yellow group. Yeah, they knew what those were. And had the pecking order changed when they got to high school? No, the smart kids were still the smart kids. And so the thing that changes here is they saw themselves as a smart kid, and then when they start having difficulty, then they think that they're just not smart anymore. But mindset is so important because it determines your reactions to many things. Challenges. People who have a fixed intelligence mindset want to avoid challenges because they think that I don't want to do something that might show that I'm not as smart as I know I am. Whereas growth intelligence folks embrace challenges because they know that that is the way to move to the next level. Obstacles, anything requiring effort. Fixed mindset folks really give up very easily. They don't persist through obstacles because they think that anything that requires effort is not worth doing. If they can't do it, if they're not smart enough to do it without really working, then they must not be smart enough to do it at all. So why would they expend any effort? Whereas growth intelligence folks recognize that tasks requiring effort and getting through obstacles, that's the path to mastery. That's how you get better. And so I didn't know this stuff. I didn't realize, I didn't know about Dweck's work until about 4 years ago. But then I started really being able to observe which of my students had which mindset, and I could talk to them about it, and they recognized themselves as having a fixed intelligence mindset, and we could, tell them that the research says, no, you can do this, but you have to do you got to do some things to get better. And I found that in many cases, those students' attitudes changed. Also works with graduate students. This student had failed. At LSU, students have to pass 6 cumulative exams a year, so they're kicked out. And as you see, this particular student had passed only 1 exam his whole first year. And so he started working with the Learning Center and the Writing Center, because some of these exams have a lot of writing on them, in October of 2005. And I would not have been able to get anybody in chemistry to bet me a dime that this guy, if he only passed 1 out of 8 the first year, he could pass 5 out of 8 the second year. And in fact, he didn't really pass 5 out of 8 the second year. He passed 5 out of 7 the second year. And he passed the December exam with the highest score in the group. And this is he. This is Dr. Algernon Kelly. He got his PhD in 2009. And then he started teaching his students. He went back to Xavier and started teaching his students. Let me just say, take a good look at this guy. This is the only guy I've ever met on the planet who has a PhD in chemistry who started out in all developmental courses. Every single course he started in was developmental. And he now has a PhD in chemistry, and he's now working at SUNY Broadport, where he's teaching students there these strategies. But he sends me emails from his students, and well, this is an email from Al himself. He said many of the students are using the study cycle. They were failing their classes, including his course in the final semester before being kicked out, and they're now top students in their respective classes. And then the next series of emails I love, he sent me a bunch of them, and we literally have some examples of before and after scores that I showed you before. But this, I think, really shows you what this information can do for students. On October 17th, he writes, "Hello, Dr. Kelly, struggling, really want to succeed, but everything I've tried seems to end with a decent grade." So this guy was spending time on the information. 1 week later, he writes, from "Hello, Dr. Kelly," to "Hey, Dr. Kelly, made an 84 on my chemistry exam compared to the 56 on my first one using your method for 2 days without prior intense studying." And then on November 3rd, it goes from "Hello, Dr. Kelly, hey, Dr. Kelly, hey, Dr. Kelly, I have increased my bio exam grade from 76 to 91.5 using your system. Ever since I started using the study cycle program, my grades have significantly improved." And then he says, "I've honestly gained a sense of hope and confidence." And that's so important. That's what students need in order to put forth any effort. My family and I are grateful that you've taken the time to get me back on track. So many students we work with are first-generation students. They want to do well. Their families want them to do well. And when they start floundering and don't know why, they don't know what to do about it. And so it's this information that can help them make the difference. And so finally, I can say that, we as tutors really can motivate our students to use metacognitive strategies. And in the session this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about emotions and motivation. But we really have to encourage them to consider what their goals are. Consider what your if you're trying to be a doctor, then it's worth it to invest in the textbook than, to say I'm going to save $100, but then lose $1 million because you never get to become a doctor. Develop a plan. Commit to doing 3 or more intense study sessions per day, 2 of them during daylight hours, and we can help them to believe in themselves when they know that we believe them. And so how can we as tutors convert students from being very passive to active participants? Well, we can teach them how to learn, we can motivate them to engage with the information, and we can help them to change their mindset. And so these are a few useful websites. We have lots of resources on the cas.lsu.edu. Students can determine their learning style. There's lots of online workshops that students can use. And these are some additional references and some acknowledgments. And thank you very much for your participation.